Hey, what is up? Welcome to this episode of the Entrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast. As always, I'm your host, Brian Lofrumento, and this is the very first episode of a new year. There's so many exciting things to come on, and today I wanted a very special guest to kick the year off, and we found an amazing one at that who's going to get us all sorts of fired up about what we can achieve in high performance in the new year in so many different ways. So let me tell you about today's guest. He is a fellow Massachusetts native. His name is Chris Mader, with over 27 years of experience in revenue generation, talent development, and corporate strategy. Chris founded MTA Consultancy to help leaders in organizations make the adjustments needed to achieve exemplary results. Now, Chris has achieved those results in his own life as a former professional athlete, adult learning expert, and chief revenue officer. Chris has a unique perspective on what drives performance, motivation, and excellence in diverse and dynamic environments. Chris is unbelievable at a lot of things. His core competencies include coaching, corporate training, growth strategy, change management, and motivational speaking. He's coached and developed leaders at all levels, from entry level all the way up to the C-suite, business development and recruitment professionals to finance and operations. He's been a guest lecturer. He's a published author on topics such as managing across multiple generations, change management, emotional intelligence, growth strategy, so much good stuff. This is going to kick our year off in the best possible way. So I'm not going to say anything else. Let's dive straight into my interview with Chris Mader. All right, Chris, happy 2024 to you. Happy 2024 to all of our listeners. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Brian. Very excited to be here.
Heck yes. So I obviously teased a little bit about your extraordinary background. You and I were talking a little bit off air, but give us the short version of your story. How did you end up doing all these amazing things, accomplishing a lot in your athletic career? Lay the short version of your story on us.
Yeah, sure. I mean, when I was a little kid, I always wanted to play professional baseball. That was my dream goal at the age of 10. I got to pursue that through high school, college, and signed a minor league contract. Played 4 years of minor league baseball, so I did check the box of playing professional sports, which was great. Then I fell into sales and was very lucky to get a great first manager in business who really trained, developed me, mentored me for about 20 years for one of the largest HR services company in the world. So I was very lucky to have a great boss. I then went on to three different roles in three different companies where I was overseeing revenue generation, talent acquisition, training, development, leadership development. And my last formal role before being an entrepreneur was in the C-suite as a CRO for a healthcare IT company. So in the past year, I found myself being a first-time entrepreneur with my own money. I think I've always had an entrepreneurial mindset. I've started up businesses for other people, but 2023 was the first year where I started my own business in executive coaching and leadership coaching and training.
Yes, I love that. And obviously at the root of so much of what you've been able to do in your athletic career, in your corporate career, is that high performance. And I think that it's so important to think about all the different elements that performance levels show up in our work, whether it is performing well when it comes to revenue, whether it is performing well when it comes to leadership. There's so much of it. So Chris, I want to start there with you, because with all those different experiences that you've had in your career, what is it that you think about when you think about high performance and achieving things in business? And heck, if you want to extrapolate, bring it out to life and athletics, we want it all from you today.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's funny, my dad was a baseball scout. And I'll start with baseball, and it relates to business. In baseball, they scout 5 key talents. They scout, hitting for average, hitting for power, speed, throwing, arm, and fielding. But as a scout, my father always said the thing that's missing on the report is heart. How do you measure somebody's heart? How do you measure their level of grit? And we've heard the word grit. There's a book on grit. So when I translate that to the business world, the 2 words that I look for when I interview people and I hire people is relentless persistence. Just somebody that won't quit or give up, I believe, is one of the key traits of the most successful people. Most successful people will say they never failed. They had a setback, right? They didn't fail. There are a number of setbacks and things that were obstacles in their way. But ultimately, the mindset they have is they didn't fail. They either win or they learn. And that's what I've seen to be consistent through my background in athletics and business through my lifetime.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's why I say it so frequently here on this show is that all of the things in life are a microcosm of, or all the things in business are a microcosm of life. Because whether we're talking baseball, which I'm sure we're going to use a million analogies today, I'm about to push you to step into one of them because I'm personally excited to hear about it. But exactly what you said. In chess, for example, we also use that phrase of you either win or you learn. It's true in business as well. So I love that perspective. I've got to ask you up front because I know it's the tagline of your business. I'm on video with you, so I can see it in your background. You've got a big sign that says, make the adjustment. When we talk about persistence, a lot of that is obviously making those adjustments. What does that mean to you, and why is it so important that it's the tagline of your business?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. It's incredibly meaningful to me for a few reasons. Other than my dad, the most meaningful person in my life was my college baseball coach, Boyd Coffey, who has since passed away. And I went to Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida. He was the head coach there for 25 years and a legend. And he had a very similar wooden sign over his desk when I met him that said, make the adjustment. And I asked him what it meant. And, Boyd at the time, I wouldn't call him the most sophisticated business professional in the world. He was an old school guy from Tennessee, Army infantry, played some baseball and basketball, but he was so far advanced, which I didn't realize in 1988, on this concept of emotional intelligence and locus of control, which is to say, the good things that happen in your life are because of what you do, and the bad things that happen in your life are because of what you do. And what he taught us with the words make the adjustment, which is what I've since named my company MTA Consultancy after, is that, we all have to adapt to the environments and situations we're in. So if you're in a relationship and things aren't working out, you can't control the other person. The only thing you can do is control yourself. And you can make the adjustments necessary to communicate better and more effectively with that other person. So whether that's a personal relationship, a work relationship, a client relationship, making the adjustment is paramount because, again, we've all heard the cliche that the only constant in life is change. And what I found is that most people think they're comfortable with change, but they really aren't. And so I challenge my clients, the people that I've worked with before and managed, to consistently, incrementally make the adjustments necessary to improve.
Yeah, I love that perspective. And gosh, I love good old stories where it's born out of sports because that's where I learned so many of my life lessons. You're right. Aside from parents and family, coaches are so incredibly important to us, especially at those formative years early on in childhood and following us through our teenage years and into college. So yeah, it's incredible hearing you pass those lessons on that you picked up from a really influential coach in Boyd back in the day for you. So along those lines, make the adjustment. I feel like it's one of those pieces of life advice where we may hear it the first time, but it takes a different way for it to really resonate with us. One such piece of advice that took me a while to learn was I learned from a speaker years ago that said, make a decision and then make the decision right. And me at 22, I was like, okay, make right decisions. But that's obviously not what that advice is all about. Walk us through making the adjustment, because I feel like it's one of those that may sound simple on the surface, but what are some real life examples of making the adjustment? Whether it's in business, whether it's in relationships, what are those adjustments that are within our control?
Yeah, I think, with emotional intelligence, the first aspect is self-awareness. And, I think Marshall Goldsmith once wrote that only 33% of people are actually truly self-aware in the moment when things are happening. So I like to challenge people in making the adjustment of when I coach clients or I talk to people like, hey, what are your strengths and weaknesses? I want to gauge their level of self-awareness. And I have an example of a client that I won't name that said, I have a hard time with self-control, which is the second phase of emotional intelligence. Chris, I'm self-aware in the moment. I know I'm getting upset, but I have a hard time controlling myself and my emotions. So making the adjustment is starting with, okay, number one, are we aware that we have a problem or an issue we want to change or adjust, whether it's a behavior or a strategy? Number two, the big step is making the adjustment in real time, in the moment when it's happening. And I'll advise clients, act like there's a camera up in the corner watching you all day. What would that person say if they were watching the camera? And how would they advise you in that moment? So it's not just making the adjustment, and it can be highly strategic down to tactical, but it's in the moment where things are happening. Can you change your behavior? Can you adjust your attitude in the moment to make the adjustment so the other side feels good about the interaction and we're moving business forward, our relationship forward, and things of that nature?
Yeah, Chris, I feel free to use all the sports analogies with you here today because now we're talking about in the moment. What I think of is the very first time I went to the US Open down in New York City. And the thing that I noticed sitting courtside is that the best players in the world, let's take Roger Federer, for example, somehow with a ball coming at him 110 miles per hour, he has this uncanny ability to create time where the rest of us are reacting. He has the ability to create time where there seemingly is none. And you talk about making these decisions in the moment as leaders of our lives, as leaders of our businesses. That's the hardest part because emotions are the first thing to brew. How do we create that time and have that clarity and that almost it feels like a third party objective? Use the example of a camera on the wall. How do we even start going about that?
Yeah, and I talk about this about, being the CEO of your life, being the CEO of your business, being the CEO of your desk. If you're a salesperson or an individual contributor in a company, you have to own your behaviors and you have to own your outcomes and you have to own the things that you do or don't do. So that's why I keep referencing things like locus of control. And I think that's a really interesting concept to talk about because as I learn this, people who have an external locus of control are people who will say, well, bad things have happened to me because of external factors. And people with a high level of internal locus of control say, no, I control the outcomes of my life and I can control things that happen for better or for worse. So I'm constantly asking people from a preparedness level, what have you done to prepare for this meeting, for this business year, we talk about, 2024, what is the pre-work that we've done to get us prepared so when the moment happens, we are better prepared and we know how to handle that situation when it happens. When you think about athletics, the same thing. There's something called overtraining. And you can talk about Roger Federer in tennis or in baseball as an example, what I learned in professional baseball. I said to my coach, what's the fastest fastball that I'm going to face at this level? He said 94 miles an hour. I said, turn the machine up to 95 because I know if I can hit 95 miles an hour, I can adjust to anything lower than 94, right? So making the adjustment is like, how do I prepare in advance for the events and things that I know that could happen? And the more prepared I am, the better. And certainly the more experienced I am, the better. I mean, if anybody's ever heard of the 10,000 hours to mastery and the outliers, once you can master something, it's a lot easier to react in the moment and make those adjustments.
Yeah, I love that perspective and those real life examples. That fastball, it reminds me of that. Prepare for the worst, but expect the best. And it's something that we as entrepreneurs get to do. But so much of our roles as executives, it's the one way, Chris, we're challenging listeners here in 2024 to start thinking more as executives. And I think that's such an important function in our lives as well as in our businesses. And part of that executive role is obviously leadership. It is managing not only ourselves, but those other people. You've been in sports. Team environments are the environments that I'm most fascinated by because there's roles for everybody. There's obviously a head coach that leads so much of it. Talk to us about what leadership means to you. I'm sure you've had bad leaders. I'm sure you've had great leaders. What are those traits that you identify with?
Yeah, great question. Again, and I always ask leaders, name the 5 competencies of managers, leaders you've worked for before that you admire. And then I say, is that you? And a lot of times people say, oh, I lack some of those. So to your point, being the CEO of your desk, executives have strategic thinking, problem solving, skillful communication, emotional control, integrity, right? So I always play the long game. Simon Sinek's great. He talks about, the infinite game. I believe the best companies, the best cultures play the infinite game, which is to say, they do the right things and they make the right decisions that are always good in the long run for their clients. And I always stack rank, clients, company, people. And if you delight your clients, you can always figure out your internal business workings and operational things. You're going to have growing pains and issues in the business. That's always going to happen. But if your clients are happy and revenue is coming in and you're growing, you can solve all the other problems. So, I've always hired, for character, trained for skill. I never take shortcuts on hiring. When I think about, management, leadership by definition is getting things done through other people. So, when I think about being a former CRO, it's how do you put the right people in the right positions to be successful? That's your job, right? Is to make the lives easier of the people you work with and work for. Servant leadership. Do you work for them or I work for them? As a leader, I always say I work for my people. They don't work for me. The old management structure of 30, 40 years ago of, whipping the chain and telling people what they need to do is long gone. You have to create a highly engaged environment where people want to come to work and they choose to come to work and be happy and engaged, because that's how they do their best work.
Yeah, Chris, I knew it wouldn't take long before we dive straight into the C word here today. And you've already mentioned it, and that is, of course, culture. And I think that culture is so fascinating because whether we are intentionally building a team culture or not, it is being built. And I think that's so important for us as leaders of our businesses to understand, because our culture is not just something that our employees and our teammates are feeling and seeing. Our clients are also seeing and feeling that when they get to work with anyone on our teams, including ourselves. Talk to us about that culture, because I think it's important for us to call out that whether it's intentional or not, it's there. What does culture mean to you? How the heck do we even start going about having a conversation about building culture?
Yeah, culture eats strategy for breakfast is the old quote, right? So I start with psychological safety. I believe even in the interview, when you first start to speak to somebody in the interview process, you're trying to build trust. And so when I talk about culture and what good culture looks like, is, to your point, I've worked in great cultures and I've worked in not so great cultures. In a great culture where people feel psychologically safe, they're willing to take more calculated risk. They're more willing to talk up to their managers and manage up and give feedback. And when you work in a bad culture, people just dive into their cubicles and they don't want to talk to leadership, and they come in and punch a clock and they do their job and they leave. And that's not how the best work gets done in this world. So, Dan Pink is another expert in this area. I've always said, he says there's three key components to culture. People want to feel autonomy, mastery, and purpose, right? They want the autonomy to do their job, not be micromanaged. They want to have a greater purpose as to why they're in the workplace. And then they want to master their craft and enjoy what they're doing. So when you start to combine those variables into the workplace, that's what I believe makes a great culture. Because I've written articles before about, if you want to find your company's culture, just go to the water cooler. Because people at the water cooler, if they're not happy, you're going to hear about it. And if they're happy, they're just going to be getting water and getting their coffee and going back to work, and everything's fine, right? So, culture, I think, can be really defined by this level of psychological safety. And do people feel safe in the workplace to share ideas? I've always said to leaders, it's not your job to have all the best ideas. It's your job to hire people that have the best ideas and allow them to do their job. So the best cultures have that. And I think the bad cultures out there, don't necessarily have that.
Yeah, I think it's important as well for us to consider that not all people who have great skills, for example, are embedded for that culture that you're creating. I think about how many sports teams, for example, a really great player walks into a great team, but it just doesn't mesh because it's not the culture of the team. So I've got to ask, this is a fun fact. I can safely say you're the first ever guest that I can say this for, Chris, is that you've played baseball with players like Michael Jordan, Derek Jeter, and Bo Jackson. Yes, for you listeners who are too young to remember that Michael Jordan stepped away from basketball to play baseball, it's absolutely true. Chris, give us some insights there, because the culture, when I hear about, Charles Barkley and Shaq talking about the culture of the dream teams and Larry Bird and Magic Johnson, I hear about the high standards that a player like Michael Jordan had. That's somebody who wants to win at all costs, but that's not for everybody. Different cultures, different teams have their own different things. What are some of those things you picked up along the way from the highest performing individuals, leaders, and team environments?
Great question. I in that year, you can remember I played for Terry Francona. So he was the manager of that team who obviously went through the minor leagues. He was a big leaguer himself, coached in the minor leagues, coached Jordan in Birmingham that year. And then he went on to a very successful major league career and won World Series. And it will go down as one of the best managers in baseball. I'll start with Tito and I'll get to Michael, because with Tito, he set very clear expectations. I think great managers set very clear expectations. So Tito would put you into the office and say, hey, Chris, here's your role in the team. Here's what I expect. It was a 5-minute meeting. And it was, I expect, work ethic at all times. We're going to show up on time. We're going to have a great attitude. And this is going to be your role in the team. And if at any point you ever have a problem with the role in your team, you come tell me, and you're not going to, vent to your teammates. And that's how it was. Off we went. When Mike is Mike, Michael goes by Mike, which is funny once you get to spend some time with him. But as an example, Tito would say, all right, guys, let's get to the field at 8 o'clock today. The stretch will be on the field for 9 and the game's at 1. Mike was there at 7. Mike was there at 6:30. And so when you start to peel the onion back on the greatest of the greats, the work ethic, the willingness to do the extra work, the willingness to ask questions, it's incredible how humble he was. He came into our clubhouse as a 3-time NBA champion, and we all knew who he was. And he was like, hey, I'm Mike. He would just go around, shake your hand, sit down with you, want to talk baseball. And I'll never forget when we broke training camp. One of the best Mike stories I have is we're breaking training camp, and everybody's going to double A, single A, big leagues, et cetera. And he asked the big league guys to go into their own locker room. And he only wanted to talk to the minor league guys. And he basically said, I'm really impressed with the level of commitment that you guys have, given the fact you really don't make any money. I came from a world where there's a bunch of prima donnas, and you guys are here because you want to be here and you're willing to put in the work, and you've just been great to me. And I just want to tell you how much I respect all of you. And I'm sitting there thinking, this guy is the number one most famous athlete potentially in the world, and he's telling us how impressed he is with us. So there's a level of like confidence and humility. I mean, we all know Michael Jordan did not lack confidence, but I think what not everybody sees is really behind the scenes, the level of humility he had and how humble he actually was, and how he treated people, which was with great respect, and he had a great work ethic. It was just a really great, I always say he was one of the best teammates I ever played with, which, it's crazy to say he was a teammate of mine, but he was for a short time.
Yeah, that is crazy, Chris, for sure. I mean it when I say you are making podcast history. The only man who's come on the show that personally knows Michael Jordan. That is such a cool, fun fact for you. And along those lines, I really enjoy the fact that with regards to the MJ story, where we're talking about is minor league baseball. And you talk about the humility behind that. I personally, living in Tampa now, I get to see the Tampa Tarpons, which is a single A team. And what always strikes me as I'm sitting there amongst me and 12 other people at George Steinbrenner Field as we're watching single A baseball is I think to myself, there's talent on this field. You and I talked about it before we hit record today, is that the average person has no idea the golfing quality of any professional athlete. They are light years better than anyone we've likely ever met in our normal lives. With that in mind, Chris, it looks easy. When we see professional sports, it looks easy to spot these guys, but there's so much that goes into identifying that talent. Now, obviously, we're not talking about sports today. We're using it as an example, but I know that with your agency, the MTA Consultancy, so much of what you do is you help businesses identify that talent. How do we even begin to do that? Because it's not as tangible as looking at someone's, batting average. How do we do that in the real world with real life personalities and individuality behind it all?
Yeah. So, good to great concept, Jim Collins, get the right people on the bus. So whenever I advise my customers when it comes to their team, not only would I have them review their current team, but when it comes to, let's just start with hiring. What are the 5 or 6 competencies you expect from that person in that role? So that's number one. Number two, what are the core values of your company? What are the 3 or 4 things that everybody needs to have? And that could be team orientation. That could be problem solving. There's all kinds of competencies that you can look after. So when it comes to onboarding new talent, you cannot shortchange yourself and cut short the things that you need in your business for the competencies that are required, also by role. So it could be sales, marketing, back office, operations, finance. You have to define those competencies clearly and interview and hire for those accordingly. In addition to that, you have to look at your current staff. Do they fit that model? And, sometimes you have the right person in the wrong seat. Sometimes you have the wrong person, and you either have to manage them up or out, which is a tough conversation, but it's part of what we do as business leaders. So, I think it starts really for me with getting the right people on the bus and making sure they have the right level of competencies and the right mindset that's needed for every role that you might have in your company.
Yeah, Chris, I need to ask this question because I know that, immature 20-something-year-old me a decade ago, just starting out my first business, I've heard people talk about identify who it is that you are, what your values are. Especially we talk about it so much within the world of branding. And I think it's fun to take these values and apply it to something that I think is even bigger than branding. I think branding falls within culture. That's what we're talking about here today. But my question to you is, Chris, is how do we make sure that these are things that go into practice? Not just buzzwords on a fancy PDF that somebody created, not just things that we say at the end of our meetings as an internal company, but how do we put it into practice? Because not only the values, but I think the high performance, the standards that we set for ourselves and for our businesses, how do we make sure that we stay on that path, especially as 2024 rolls along?
Yeah. And some of the variables I consider with my customers would be things like, okay, competency based hiring, competency based. But then you have like a 360 review can be a great way to examine the heartbeat of the company, right? A 360 review can be an anonymous review that employees fill out on behalf of their management team. Also, to your point, I measure the key leading indicators. Some of the concepts I love are from the 4 disciplines of execution. What are the 1 or 2 wildly important goals that you want to have this year from a result perspective? And what are the 1 or 2 wildly important leading indicators to help run your business? And you have to almost scorecard all of those things. So you have competencies, 360 review, results, activities. You can talk about an NPS score. I've also been hired to run NPS engagement surveys for companies. And you think about best places to work awards, a lot of times they use these NPS scores. It's a great way to check the temperature and the heartbeat of a company, is to kind of peel the onion back via these anonymous surveys, employee surveys, NPS surveys, 360 reviews, to really get a feel for, are we living up to the values that we have written on the walls on our website and who we say we are.
Yeah, really good perspective. I think it's so important. My word of 2023 was intention. And I think that intentionality is at the core of all of our abilities to grow. And along those lines, Chris, I also think that we're always going to be limited by the quality of questions that we ask. The questions that we ask are going to determine the quality of the answers that we get. With that in mind, as a leader, as an executive, what types of questions should we be asking our teams, ourselves, our clients, in order to make sure that all of this stuff is manifesting in the real world the way that we want it to?
Yeah. One of my favorite questions to ask in that way is, start with the end. So I say, what does good look like at the end of the year, the quarter, 5 years? What does good look like? And then you can start to go back to, okay, well, what is the goal, right? Establishing SMART goals, specific, measurable, attainable, timeline, realistic, et cetera. So I always like to say, though, like, what does good look like at the end? And that's one of the 7 habits of highly effective people is, what does good look like? What do we expect? And then once you get the end, it's easy to start back into, what's the mission? What's the goal? What are the action items? What are the bullets we're going to write down as far as the actions taken to get to the end? And how long will that realistically take?
Yeah, big questions, the strategic questions that we as leaders need to carve that time aside to ask ourselves and then ask our teams. Because again, coming back to intentionality, how the heck are we going to get to our destination if we don't know what that destination is? So I love that perspective, Chris. Along those lines, where do we get this stuff wrong? There's so many difficult aspects of the journey, Chris, and I'm sure you've seen it manifest in a million different ways. What's so hard about this stuff? Because it's easy in concept, harder in reality. What have you seen for us getting off the path?
Yeah. So most people, entrepreneurs, right? We're successful individual contributors at something, and then we grow and become leaders. And whether you're in corporate America or you're an individual entrepreneur, I always find it fascinating when I look at statistics like from SHRM. 84% of people have stress in the workplace because of their boss. More than half of the people in this country quit their job solely because of their boss. And part of that is because we grow up as an expert in something. We grow into a leadership role, but we never get trained, or we never have a coach, or we never have somebody guiding us as to what it means to be a great leader. When you look at the competencies that are needed to do well at a job, right? So whether it's marketing or sales or playing a guitar that I have behind me, I believe that it's the leader's job is to make the people's job easier. And if you never receive training or guidance on what does it mean to be a good leader, I think people just fall into it a lot of times and they do the best they can, but they've never been trained on how to manage their time. They've never been trained on delegation. They've never been trained on the differences between leadership and management. They've never been trained on how to write a business plan. I mean, there's all these things that people just they don't know what they don't know. And they're in these elevated roles. And sometimes they get it right, and sometimes they get it wrong, and half the time they don't even know why they got it right or wrong. And I just think it's that's why I do what I do. The Simon Sinek Start with Why. The reason I'm a leadership coach is, one of the taglines of MTA Consultancy is, we want to hire, train, and identify better leaders in this world, because there aren't enough good ones out there, due to all the aforementioned reasons I just gave you earlier.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny. I always think about that in a world where everybody can be an influencer. We have so few vocal leaders. I think back, obviously, I'm too young to remember the days of Martin Luther King Jr., but what I look at societally is where are the leaders here? You open up Instagram and you see a bunch of pranksters, but the world is crying out for great leadership. And you just articulated in a way that I've never thought about within the corporate world. So the one corporate job I had, which was in healthcare in good old Worcester, Massachusetts, I realized that if I would be the best analyst that I could be, I was a business analyst, I would get promoted to a management position, but I was really good at being a business analyst. I was really good at Microsoft Excel. That doesn't serve me. With that in mind, Chris, I don't want to lead people to a cliff. So what is your advice there? Obviously, reps is one thing. Having more at-bats as a leader is important. We learn that way. But what are the other ways that we can set ourselves up for success because we haven't been trained in these domains?
I mean, at the end of the day, you own your own development. And so even though I was very lucky to have a great manager, Bob Dickey was my first manager in business in 1996, and I can't speak highly enough of what he did for me. But what he also instilled in me is that, again, like, it's up to me to develop my own skills. And so in learning development, I've been a former chief people officer before, and I kind of coined this phrase called the triangle of learning. The triangle of learning in a company or in a smaller firm would be the employee has to take ownership of their own development, the leader has to take ownership of the employee's development, and the training team has to support all of that. But I always say that no matter how much coaching and training I give somebody, they have to want to do the work themselves and be a self-paced learner and self-learner. I can tell you how many books, I mean, I've referenced a few of them today. I have a bachelor's degree. I didn't get my master's because back in the early 90s, that wasn't the thing to do. I'd probably do it now if I could today. But with that said, I am so well versed on so many topics based on me taking ownership of my own development. And as a result, I've gotten to pass that on as a leader to other leaders. I talk about the leadership coaching tree, and we can joke about Massachusetts Bill Belichick. We're having a tough year with the Patriots this year, but if you look at the number of people that he's trained and developed that have been head coaches in the NFL, he has one of the largest coaching trees out there. So I admire leaders that train and develop their staff to become leaders, right? So leaders develop leaders. And that's how I view that.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And you know what? It strikes me so much. Obviously, I'm biased as a New Englander. But yeah, the example of Bill Belichick, that he is producing those leaders. It's something that I used to say back in my early 20s as I was growing my businesses, is I would say when I hire someone, I hope you outgrow me and you go on to do other things. Now in my head, I'm just like, I hope you grow to lead more people that we get to hire here. So yeah, really important point there, Chris. So much wisdom that you've dropped on us. And I always say success leaves clues. And I love the fact that you even called out. It's something that struck me is how many books you've referenced along the way. Those are glimpses for us listeners. If you want to see how Chris worked on this stuff, he's literally telling you authors and books that have influenced him. So really good advice from you there, Chris, and really good insights. And it lends me, I keep saying this quote, Mark Twain, don't let school get in the way of your education. So much of life happens through reps. So really powerful. But Chris, you've kicked the year off really strongly for us. You've set the bar very high for us here in 2024. What's the takeaway? What's the one thing that listeners are sitting here going, gosh, I need to look inward. Chris is making me realize I need to start with me in this journey of high performance, of growth. What's the actionable thing that you think every listener should do from here to set themselves up for success this year?
Well, it's funny. So we talk about all the books I've referenced. I'm actually in the middle of writing my first book, which is oddly enough entitled Make the Adjustment. And it's about behavior change. And, the advice I have for anybody is a positive mindset can overcome a lot of adversity. And I have faced my share of adversity in my life. And part of the reason I am now an entrepreneur is, I worked in corporate America for 27 years and had a lot of successes. But I really just got to the point where I was tired of working for other people. And, I was willing to take a chance on myself. And so I think for, your listeners, it's basically having the right mindset of what you want and being unique and being authentic is everything. When you ask about questions to ask, I want to work with people that are authentic. And, whatever your brand is, that's who you are and that's what you want to leverage. My brand in my life has been, I've been able to figure out the algorithm to overcome obstacles and navigate change successfully and ultimately make the adjustment. So, I'm excited that this book is coming out next year. And, really, this is going to be a book on behavior change, mindset, how to overcome obstacles, and the algorithms that are required to better your situation both at work and outside of work as well.
Boom. Clear homework for all of us as we start the year. So much that we need to do to set our sails and live with this sort of intention that Chris is challenging us to aspire towards personally and as leaders of our businesses and heck of our lives. So much important stuff. And obviously I'm super excited about your book, Chris. I know how much work goes into that. And it's a natural segue for listeners who are super keen, as I am, to go deeper in following you, your own personal entrepreneurial journey, as well as your business, MTA Consultancy. Where the heck should they go? Drop those links on us.
You bet. www.mtaconsultancy.com is my website, and you can find us on LinkedIn under MTA Consultancy as well as on Instagram under MTA Consultancy.
Yes, listeners, you know we like it to make it as easy as possible for you. So wherever it is that you're tuning in, scroll right on down, find the show notes, and we are linking to Chris's business website, mtaconsultancy.com. We're also putting a link to Chris's personal LinkedIn. So if you want to connect with him there, he also has, I'm just going to give a quick shout out before we get off the air here today. You have a weekly thought leadership on your website called The Coach's Corner. I love that. So listeners, head on over to mtaconsultancy.com. You can sign up for that free newsletter as well as follow Chris on LinkedIn. So Chris, thank you so much for sharing all of this here with us today on the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast.
Thanks, Brian. It's been great to be here. Happy New Year, everybody.